My students say I don't need any projection. Hi. I'm Ed Barbanell. I teach philosophy here, environmental philosophy here at the University of Utah, and welcome to our afternoon session. We have three people talking on the same topic. If you were at Peter Glick's talk earlier today, he talked that there were many fronts on which we could attack the water problem, rights and policy, and that's what this particular session is devoted to. Three speakers talking about different aspects of rights, getting people involved in the political process, and different ways of conceptualizing markets for water. Each will give a presentation. We'll introduce them right before each of their presentations, and then we'll keep questions for the end, okay? So our first presenter today, Susan Spronk, is an assistant professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. Her research focuses on experience of development in Latin America, and the topic of her talk today is struggles for water justice in Latin America, alternatives to privatization.
So I want to thank you all, number one, for being here, and hopefully you all got a coffee, because I know it's the first session after lunch. It's a real honor to be here and to be invited to this conference. And when I was thinking about what to present to you today, I decided that what I'd like to do is to share with you some of the research that I've done with activists in Latin America through a project called the Municipal Services Project. So I'll be explaining some of that. But I just want to start by talking about, in some ways, this panel is about something completely different. We've been talking about the world water crisis. We've been talking about climate change. And one of the things that Peter mentioned over the keynote talk is the importance of institutions. And my talk is going to pick up on the democracy element of the title of this panel. And I'm going to be talking to you about three experiences in Latin America which are about democracy and about alternatives to privatization in Latin America. So what I'm going to try to convince you of this afternoon is that we are, in Latin America anyway, moving beyond what I'm going to call the public-private debate, which I see as a debate that is very much about what's characteristic of the neoliberal period. One of the things that's exciting about Latin America, particularly South America, where I do most of my work, being Venezuela and Bolivia, as well as a number of other countries, there's really a debate about moving beyond neoliberalism, and we can call it either that neoliberalism in the period is over, or perhaps more accurately a post-structural adjustment period where the institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank do not have the stranglehold on that region as they did during the height of neoliberal hegemony in the 1990s. So I'm going to be talking about that debate, and then I'm going to tell you about the Municipal Services Project, which is a project which is trying to map these alternatives in Latin America, but also elsewhere in different public services. And then thirdly, share with you some of three of the alternative models of service provision that came from this exercise, this research project that I conducted with the Municipal Services Project. Now, my background is in politics and also historical sociology, and so one of the things, and just speaking with Simon right before this talk, is the importance of context. And I think one of the things that strikes me in North America is how narrow our vision of the world is. And I was in Bolivia in 2004, 2005. And in some ways it was a converting experience because the debates going on in this country in which about 62% of the population self-identifies as indigenous are in some ways way beyond the kinds of debates that we're having here, where we talk about very narrow concepts such as economic good related to water. It's not a debate that you're having in Bolivia in the same way, unless you're talking to someone who works for the World Bank. So let me talk about democracy, returning to my points, and sharing a quote with you by Eduardo Galeano, who's also written The Open Veins of Latin America, which was the book that Hugo Chavez famously gave Obama during one of his visits, or one of their encounters. And he writes, and this is referring to the context of authoritarianism, which characterized the region of Latin America and the Caribbean between the 1960s up until the 1990s. In fact, by the 1970s, 18 out of 21 countries were run by non-constitutional governments. Since then, there has been the third wave of democratization, but he writes in the context of these authoritarian governments in Uruguay at the time, 1970s, they wanted to take away our right to water, but they could never because they could not take away our thirst. So to draw attention as well to the very long tradition of revolutionary struggle in Latin America as well, which is certainly not something that we see in North America, but I think also informs, again, some of these debates in Latin America, those revolutionary struggles being indigenous struggles, but also revolutionary workers' movements, which have been much more present in Latin America than in North America. So to talk about the policy problem that we're here to talk about, and we're talking about institutions, something that I call the water problem of the developing world. And the photograph that you see on your left is a photograph that I took in Cochabamba, Bolivia. This is after the famous water war that some of you have, I'm sure, heard about, if you're water activists at all. And what we see here are women who, if I could zoom into the photograph, you will probably notice that they are not women that look like me, although there are certainly lots of women in Bolivia who look like me, but rather women who are definitely of indigenous descent, lower income women who come from the barrios, perhaps, who have to rely on alternative water sources because they do not have a connection to the formal water provider, the public water provider, an unsafe source of water, which of course leads to all the health problems that we're very familiar with. And so the water problem in the Global South is really one of institutions and also one of a colonial past and the particular form of development in Latin America, where the whole discussion even of bottled water in Latin America is a very different one, because in most cases in Latin America, you do not want to drink the water that comes from the tap. If you have an iron gut like me, you can boil the water and drink the water, but most people that I know actually cannot rely on their public provider even. Those are middle-class white people in the center of the city that can't rely on their public provider. So there's a very serious problem in the developing world when we're talking about access to safe water, even improved water sources. And we've all seen these statistics before. They change depending on the year of the UN documents you're quoting, but over 900, 800 million people lack access to water. Over 2.4 billion lack access to basic sanitation. And so this water problem, which has been a problem for decades, especially with urban growth, it's become even more severe. In the 1990s, the donor agencies, again, those being the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, in the context of Latin America, the Inter-American Development Bank being another important player, started to build private sector participation as a sort of magic bullet solution that is going to solve this crisis under using various arguments. And more recently, the United Nations has committed to what are called the Millennium Development Goals, to have the number of people without access to water between 2000 and 2015. So what happened during the privatization decade, which was the 1990s, and how far did we get with this model for trying to provide water? So this is a graph that shows from 2003 some of the investment commitments. This is private sector investment commitments in developing countries between the 1990s and 2003. And what we see through this graph is, number one, a spike in the 1990s, and those represent the larger concessions in cities such as Manila, the Philippines, also Buenos Aires in Argentina, but then dwindling since then. And so what's become clear after the privatization decade is that privatization actually, according to a lot of progressive scholars, has been a setback. Because donors, such as the IMF and the World Bank, were relying on the private sector to pick up the slack, the actual amount of money that has been invested in the infrastructure in the developing world has actually gone down as a result of privatization. So it didn't work out as happens. Part of the problem is that the World Bank and the IMF, of course, part of the privatization story in Latin America in particular, is that it wasn't, these were decisions made by governments heavily influenced by the World Bank or the IMF coming to you to say, look, you need you need a loan to stabilize your macroeconomy. If you want this loan, you have to privatize water services in order to qualify for the loan. So in these later in the later stages of structural adjustment, the public water companies as well started to hit the auction block. Now, it's important to note that by 2003, the international donor community also realized that there was a problem with investment. Again, magic bill solution. The private sector is the only one with the expertise and the money that's necessary to build this infrastructure. But in 2003, Michael Kamdasou, who used to be the president, struck a commission, he's from the IMF, to look at this problem of the private sector companies themselves going to the IMF saying, look, we can't do it. It's too risky, it's too expensive. We've plucked the cherries that were the companies that were worth privatizing because they are highly urban populations, they are wealthy populations, etc. We can't do it without more public commitments of fund, which begs the question, why can't that money be used for boosting the public sector? So within this decade of the 1990s, there was roughly what I'm going to talk about 3 positions that developed. The first one being the pro-privatization position, which again, the IMF and the World Bank were behind that, which said that only multinational corporations have the capital necessary for expansion of infrastructure. Public utilities are inherently inefficient. Versus the anti-privatization discourse, which also emerges, and we hear people like Maud Barlow, many of us in this room who attend international conferences as well, who say things like water is not a commodity like any other, it cannot be privatized, it is a human right, and the state should be responsible for providing the service. But what I want to suggest is that this debate is actually a narrow debate, and that we also need to be thinking a bit more about the third position in a debate, which is that it's actually not even only about public or private, but rather the barriers for access for those who do not have access to the public water companies exist whether or not it is publicly or privately owned, meaning state-owned. And again, when I started this presentation, I was talking to you about Eduardo Galeano, his comments on the mistrust of the state that exists in a lot of communities in Latin America, particularly indigenous communities for obvious reasons. But there is a debate happening about pushing beyond what is seen as only the state sector. And so that is to say that a lot of the privatization debate that happened in the 1990s is actually missing the point, that we need to be looking much more about those models of governance which push the state or the public as well to become much more responsive to those people who do not have access to basic services. And that's where the Municipal Services Project is also trying to intervene in the debate. As I pour water. So, what were the results of this decade of privatization? Just very quickly here, and then I'll move on to alternatives. And we can go on. You can feel free to ask questions. This is hopefully a summary for a lot of you. But what we saw after the decade of privatization was an uneven pattern of investment between regions. The major investments were in Latin America because of some of those factors that I mentioned, that private sector private companies are interested in privatizing companies which are actually working well, which is why privatization as an argument is actually not very convincing if you're talking about expanding access to services. Private companies have to make profit. And so you are going to pick those best performing public companies over the, excuse my words, but crappy water company like that in Cochabamba is actually one of the last ones that anyone is going to bid on. So we saw an uneven pattern of investment between regions. Major concentrations of capital went to places like Latin America rather than where it's really needed, sub-Saharan Africa. Also a concentration on large cities, avoiding rural areas altogether. Again, when you look at the statistics, most people who do not have improved or access to improved water or sanitation live in rural areas rather than cities where it's easier, cheaper, economies of scale to provide services. And that most of the financing for these contracts came from bilateral and multilateral agencies. And this is something that Maud Barlow in her work, Blue Gold, has also drawn attention to. And one of the contracts that I studied when I was in Bolivia in 2005 was that in the capital city. And an independent auditor, after the contract was canceled, found that out of the $120 million that was invested over the life of the contract, only about $11 million of that actually came from the company itself, when the rest of it was money from the World Bank. So why is the World Bank favoring these private companies over public companies. So just to repeat, overall investment declined, and so what we need to think about now are about alternatives. But to summarize or to end this part of the talk, I have two concerns about privatization. Number one is this problem of inequality, it not solving the problem of inequality. But secondly, the problem of accountability, which is where I think we need to be looking at these new models of governance. And one of the problems of accountability when we're looking at private sector participation is that private companies are, by their structure, if they're publicly traded companies, are accountable to their shareholders, not citizens. If they're not publicly traded companies, they are accountable to their board of directors. And so we need to be asking questions about democracy when we're looking at questions of accountability and governance and trying to improve these institutions which provide water. And my work has looked mainly at urban water supply privatization, as was the Municipal Services Project. So briefly, the Origin, it's an academic research project which seeks to map and explore alternatives to privatization, and we work with key stakeholders, being workers, particularly organized workers, trade unions, and citizens groups of various types. Our aims are to publicize the results in a variety of formats, including academic and popular media. And it's a project that's funded by the International Development Research Center, who has given us a grant to do 5 years of research with researchers from all over the world. And so our network includes academic institutions, including Rhodes University in Grahamstown, South Africa, Queen's University in Canada, the School of African and Oriental Studies at the University of London, San Simeon University in Cochabamba, and also the University of Ottawa. And in terms of the activist networks that we work with, or activist academic networks, the Transnational Institute, which is based in Amsterdam, People's Health Movement, which is a global movement that looks at the questions of primary health, Focus on the Global South, the Public Service International Research Unit, which does work on and with trade unions, the Public Services International, the Red Vida, which is the organization, the largest anti-privatization network in Latin America that I worked with to do the research that I'm going to tell you about, as well as the Africa Water Network, and Equinet, which is an organization which looks at health alternatives in health in Africa. 5 minutes? Okay, so I'm going to skip towards what is an alternative to privatization, how are we defining that? Any service delivery system that is explicitly designed to improve services without the involvement of the for-profit private sector. And again, I've named for you some of the reasons why we think those questions of accountability are important. And these alternatives can include public, state, or non-profit organizations. So I'm going to go forward, oops, I'm going backwards, to talk about the three alternatives. Now, just to make a long story short, 9 research teams, Latin America, Asia, Africa, health, water, electricity, went out to do what we called mapping exercises, which included interviewing activists, key informants, such as researchers, in these 9 sectors and geographical areas, to talk to people about what they were talking about in terms of the top alternatives. And so these 3 are 3 that I'm going to talk about. We do document 22 of them in the chapter that I'll quote at the end. But at the risk of perhaps getting into a debate about some contentious issues, particularly in the North American context, I'm going to talk to you about Venezuela, Caracas, Cochabamba, Bolivia, and also a community system in Cali, Colombia. So the first one, and here again I think we could get into debates about the merits and problems with the new left turn in Latin America. One of the problems in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, which has a population of about 7 million, is again this problem of the poorest people who live on the hillsides in this Andean city do not have access to water. In the 1990s, there was a progressive mayor called Aristóbulo Estúrez, who decided to call a series of public forums with people from these neighborhoods to talk about the problem of water provision, because people in these neighborhoods would not have access to potable water in this otherwise very developed country with a lot of oil wealth. And so what emerged eventually from this experiment was the Mesas Técnicas del Agua, or called the Water Technical Tables. So the communities through these Mesas Técnicas del Agua are involved in the mapping, diagnosis, and planning of urban infrastructure. Again, it's a public company which has looked for ways to increase the participation of those who were otherwise excluded from the system. So since the election of Hugo Chavez in 1999, these mesas técnicas del agua have actually been institutionalized at the national level. And so they hire young people in their 20s and 30s to go out to communities to coordinate these participatory processes to look at the problems of service provision. So however critical we are of things going on in Venezuela, there are some really interesting things happening at the community level with respect to participation, talking about co-responsibility. So the other one that I'll describe to you rather briefly, and please feel free to ask questions about any of these things, is that of the Association of Community Water Systems in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And this is an organization that is also born out of the experience of what was called the Water War in 2000, when the population of this Andean city took to the streets to kick out an American or a subsidiary of an American corporation, Bechtel, which was given the concession contract in 1999. After 6 months, people took to the streets and kicked out the company. Now, one of the misunderstandings of the water war is that it's about the tariffs, or the fact that when a private company comes in, the water rates went up, which is absolutely true. But the people who were in some ways more important were the people who were not affected by those tariffs because they did not even have connections to this public water company. Only about 45–50% of the urban population of Cochabamba has connection to the public water company. The rest of the people that participated in those protests were drilling their own wells in the city, provided, well, like the University of Utah does actually, but also the peasant irrigators on the outskirts of the city. And so the Association of Community Water Systems, or ASICASUR, represents those people with their own wells who, seeing the peasant irrigators, decided to form their own association to try to articulate and also negotiate with this public company that has historically neglected them and not taken their concerns into account. And so through their organization, they are negotiating with the public company to try to buy water in bulk and to maintain their control over their community-run water systems. And there's a number of delicacies involved with that, but the common thing between these two systems is this idea that what we need to talk about more is this co-responsibility or co-management between city and state. So maybe I'll just summarize and leave the one about Cochabamba to the end, but what I do want to highlight here is the question of democracy. It's not merely a matter of scale, but when we're looking at an organization like ASICASUR, this top box here is the Asamblea General, or the General Assembly of all the water users. Once a year, everybody who's a member of this system gets together to vote on policies and priorities, working in some ways like a democratic trade union will work with the directorship taking its directions from this democratic assembly. So thinking about these alternative models of management, which were much more democratic than the kind of technical systems that we have in North America in the context of weak states like Bolivia, like Venezuela potentially as well, being an important point that I'd like to leave you with. And so in our mapping of alternatives, and I will end very quickly, one of the things that needs to be highlighted is that there is no perfect alternative and that there's a lot of trade-offs. One of the things that we were given 11 indicators, including efficiency, participation, working conditions, etc. And you see a lot of trade-offs happening, which is what this graph was trying to represent. And I'll just highlight one. Although Hydrocapital, which is in the top column there, has very good user participation, that is the citizens, not so great in terms of including workers in the participation of or the management of the company. And also problems or complaints by the workers themselves about the conditions under which they work. And so you see a lot of tensions in every model, and these political trade-offs having to be part of this conversation about what models of management we should be discussing. And so in conclusion, that the privatization project, especially that was sold in the 1990s, has failed, but that it's also not possible to go back to what we might call the old public, for this fact that historically we have seen that only those people in the center of the city or elites have had access to public water services. And we need to look at other kinds of models and what we call the social public model as possible alternatives to trying to rectify these inefficiencies of the public sector management that have been led historically to the water problem and Latin America. So I encourage your questions on any of those questions, Latin America. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. What a great segue into our second speaker, Simeon Herskovits from the Western Environmental Law Center. It's the Southwest office based in Taos. He's also a staff attorney and the acting director of that center. And he's going to talk to us about interbasin transfers in the American Southwest, and the political process of getting people involved, non-government organizations involved. Is that correct? More or less. Okay. So.
Thanks. Thank you, Ed. And I want to also thank the organizers of the conference. It's been a fascinating conference so far, and it's an honor to be here and speak with you. I'll just make one quick correction, which is that I actually am now the director and chief counsel of a different firm, Advocates for Community and Environment, but still based in Taos, New Mexico, and happy to be visiting lovely Salt Lake City, too. I am a lawyer, practitioner, and I will be speaking in probably a little bit of a more mundane and hopefully pragmatically grounded or oriented vein. And I say that because my work is essentially with different types of activist organizations and different rural communities in the West on interbasin transfers and on trying to protect rural communities and environmental values from the potentially very severe harms of those types of transfers. I think it's probably already been said at least once, if not 2 or 3 times at the conference, but I'll just point out again that interbasin transfers are common in the West. It's a truism or a maxim that water flows uphill to money and power in the West, and the history of the settlement and development of the West is largely a history of interbasin transfers. So in trying to counteract that, well, counterbalance that history, I suppose, and also counteract the increasing pressures for ever more aggressive transfer projects, such as groundwater pumping and pipelines and potentially new aqueducts as well. One of the things that we have to do is think about what sorts of legal and political mechanisms are available and what sorts of constituencies or communities need to get involved and how to maximize their participation and make it most meaningful to rebalance, you could say, the gradient of the flow of water in the West. And just I don't know whether this is unnecessary, but the gradient refers to the slope of water in groundwater systems. So water flows downhill, and that's true underground as well as above ground. I also I'm going to basically talk about a few lessons or thoughts that I've developed over the course of more than a decade of this kind of work in Western states from New Mexico to California. I want to frame it in the context of one particular proposed transfer, which Maud Barlow mentioned last night. It's a massive proposed groundwater transfer, development and transfer project, which the Southern Nevada Water Authority, Las Vegas's water purveyor, has proposed and is very aggressively pursuing. And I have been working with a broad coalition of very diverse types of people and communities for now several years to try and prevent this from occurring. And I think that this brings the issues that some of the speakers at least have been talking about right home to Utah here, because this is a project that begins in Nevada but ultimately would tap into the groundwater of western Utah as well, and over time would have potentially devastating impacts over quite a large expanse of Utah, as well as, of course, Nevada, unfortunately. Before I describe, and I want to provide a little bit of an overview, I will try not to bury you in detail, But before I do, I want to make a point. I work in the Western United States with Western water law. And so there are certain differences in the work I do and in the language that we necessarily use in that work from a broader or more conceptual and academic discussion of the right to water and the problems with privatization of water. For years now, although I sympathize greatly with the people who discuss things in terms of a human right to water and an absolute problem with privatization of water resources, that isn't a reality I can work with on a daily basis or on a pragmatic level, because under Western water law, people have, and for a long time now, have had private rights to use water. And they're extremely attached to that. And I think if you're going to work with these people and try and protect them and their traditional uses, particularly in agrarian communities, you need to understand and respect the fact that at some level, a private right in water is almost universally assumed and embraced in America, in the Western United States at least. In addition, I have worked on, and I think there are tremendous concerns, structural concerns as well as very specific concerns to individual cases with the corporatization or the privatization of water, in the sense of corporations and companies taking it over and promoting a more free market commodification type of management of water resources. That is clearly problematic, and even the very conservative ranchers and farmers who I frequently work with and who are passionate about their private right to water are deeply opposed to that kind of a trend in water resource allocation or management. And there's actually a history in Western water law of concern over the potential harms from water speculation that goes back all the way to the early years of Western water law's formation. And when I say Western water law, I apologize to those of you who focus more beyond the United States. I am speaking specifically about Western United States water law. And I want to also point out that privatization, if it is applied too superficially as a concept, is not going to do justice or promise to thoroughly address the potential dangers of aggressive interbasin transfers to promote unsustainable growth or unwise and ill-considered development, residential development, commercial resort development, those sorts of things. With Las Vegas, we talk typically about the construction industry. It's centered both on certain types of entertainment-oriented resort development and also increasingly over the 90s and the first decade of this millennium, residential, massive, unsustainable, frankly insane development in the desert, dependent on the premise that you can just import whatever water you will need or want. But I'm questioning privatization itself because you must understand this is a transfer, the one that the Southern Nevada Water Authority has proposed, that is being backed by and aggressively pursued by a public agency. This is the public sector entity that has the duty of finding and serving finding water and then providing water to service the needs or demands of people in Clark County in Southern Nevada, Las Vegas and its suburbs. The issue is that it's every bit as evil as the very first Inter-Basin transfer that I worked on over a decade ago, the Cadiz Water Project in Southern Nevada, where that was an outright private corporate water grab with the complicity of some arguably not terribly principled public officials. And that was a case of pure privatization, I guess you could say. This is an instance where we have an agency that is proposing to take the water in the name of the public, provide it to a growing city, Las Vegas, to provide it to the public or a sector of the public. But it is doing so largely at the behest of private development interests in Las Vegas. In fact, I would say entirely at the behest of those interests. So I think it's important to scrutinize the nature of the transfer or the water allocation decision being made, the proposal, and also look at the relationship between what may at first glance appear to be a public allocation of water by public entities for the public good, and carefully examine who are the winners and losers, what are the economic interests or other interests being served by that, before one categorizes it and classifies it as either a good or a bad transfer or a lesser, greater, or more trustworthy method or proposal for water rights management, water resource management. So let me give you a quick overview of the pipeline project itself. I'm going to refer to SUNWA as I speak. That's an acronym, SNWA, for the Southern Nevada Water Authority, which is too much of a mouthful, frankly. So SUNWA originally proposed this pipeline in a less specific form over 20 years ago in 1989, and then proceeded to delay implementation and do some other things with other communities around Nevada and private corporate entities to shift some of the water rights applications that underlay their proposal around, and to narrow it, and also, I think, whether or not it was intentionally to deceive people in Nevada who were concerned, and Utah, into believing that the project had been dropped, that was the practical impact, and that created a real big problem with awareness of the project and an ability to participate when it was started up again almost 20 years later. Now, the pipeline project is a groundwater development proposal stretching through a number of rural valleys in eastern Nevada, not in the most northern part of it, but far to the north of Las Vegas itself. The pipeline that would be built to convey the water from these valleys would be approximately 300 miles long, and the amount of water that would be pumped out on an annual basis from these valleys is in the vicinity of 200,000 acre-feet of water per year, which, to put it in a more sort of comprehensible set of terms, is approximately 65 billion gallons of water per year. These are all high desert valleys, and if you were to go to them, you would not imagine that there is really much of any water available. And frankly, it's not just a matter of there appearing to be little or no surplus water in a genuine sense in these valleys. The farmers and ranchers who have lived there and worked the land for generations, and the Native Americans who have been there for many, many generations, are much more aware of the sensitivity of local water resources to even the limited local use of water that occurs or has occurred historically in these valleys. And from their experience, they know that they have had to limit that use and moderate the impacts that they themselves cause. I don't think that historically the Native American communities really were using water in a way that caused any sort of drawdown or impact of consequence, but certainly Anglo-American settlement brought that sort of thing in. But the farmers and ranchers in these valleys have, on the whole, developed over the years a relatively sustainable base of agriculture. They are able to grow crops and livestock, and although people will sometimes question the acceptability of cattle or sheep in the West, this is a reality that's been in this area for over a century now, and to a large extent, these people have managed to develop a sustainable agricultural economy, or a set of economies in these different valleys, that does not devastate the environment, and that has allowed each other, that has sort of allowed these communities to grow and be quite vital for a number of years now. This dates back in some of the earliest instances to Mormon colonies that were started in the mid-19th century, or the second half of the 19th century, and also some mining towns that have moved into other areas of activity as well. I think that there's a little apparent water in these valleys, and beyond what's not apparent, it's important to understand that the proposal to mine, well, I shouldn't jump to that conclusion, the proposal to pump so much water from this arid rural environment is also tied together with an underground water system that is more complex and much more extensive than the shallow valley, and they're not necessarily shallow, but the valley fill aquifers in each individual valley. Interconnected with those more localized aquifers is a groundwater system based in the Carbonate Rock Province, or Carbonate Aquifer it's sometimes called, that extends through much of the Great Basin. It is a groundwater system that's deeper than the valley fill aquifers, but in many places there are demonstrable connections between the two. The Carbonate Aquifer system extends from western and even central Utah in certain areas all the way to Death Valley in California, and encompasses virtually the entire state of Nevada. The proposal to pump aggressively from these half dozen rural valleys then is not only going to affect the valleys themselves and draw them down in a short term, it is also going to tap into this broader regional system, and that's one of the bases for it. The idea is that the system is so big that they can pump aggressively and get a lot of water in the short term out of it. The problem is that the proposal is clearly out of sync with the natural recharge rate of this groundwater system. As Peter Glick mentioned this morning, frequently in some aquifers, the groundwater that's found is fossil water. It has taken thousands or tens of thousands of years to accumulate. And that's the case in many parts of the carbonate aquifer system. And indeed, even in the valley fill aquifers of these valleys, to pump so aggressively and drain it so rapidly would be something that the recharge rate locally could not possibly catch up with in a meaningful time frame. So the reason I mention the extensiveness of the carbonate aquifer system is that the proposal to engage in what would be groundwater mining, meaning the unsustainable pumping of groundwater at a rate that's too fast to naturally recharge, would extend to many other valleys and affect a number of resources in Utah and in Nevada, and communities, natural resources and communities. And I want to talk to you now about, so I've described what the project is in some basic terms and sort of the geographic scope, perhaps, of the water involved. I want to talk about specific impacts or endangerment. With the groundwater mining I've described, there would be an accumulating drawdown in a region that would probably end up being hundreds of thousands of square miles of perhaps 700 to over 1,000 feet in the groundwater table. So a really dramatic drawdown over a long term. And this is a many multi-billion-dollar project that is intended to supply Las Vegas with water indefinitely. So it has to be looked at in a long time step or a long term of centuries. And not just a couple of decades. And indeed, I don't think that it's plausible that a system like this would be built at such great cost with the idea that an urban population would become dependent on it and that it would then be possible to turn the spigot off, which I think is also an expression that Maud used. So there would be massive drawdown. On an environmental level, this would have devastating impacts on wildlife habitat. There are several national wildlife refuges within the region I've described. There's one, the Fish Springs National Wildlife Refuge in Utah, and several in Nevada. There are only over 130 endemic wetland and spring-dependent species in the area. 20 of those species are listed as threatened or endangered and would be severely jeopardized if the water table were drawn down. And there would be a great loss of plant life, phreatophytic plant life, which depends on groundwater availability. This would also, in turn, have the potential to severely degrade the national parks and the state parks and recreation areas. And most conspicuously among those is Great Basin National Park in Snake Valley, which is just over the border in Nevada. I think also it's important to recognize that the desiccation of the wetlands, the springs, and the playas in this area would result in the potential for massive dust emissions or dust generation and dust storms. That's the sort of thing you've perhaps heard about and seen pictures or video of from Owens Lake and Owens Valley in California. These are areas, very expansive areas with significant territory that is now vegetated, is now kept moist or wet by the groundwater system, despite it being a high desert environment. Should this all be desiccated, at least according to people at DRI who I've spoken with, there's no question that there would be a high risk of the potential for large-scale dust storms from the area. Now, you need to understand that that will affect the communities locally, but it will also affect other areas in the broader windshed or airshed of these valleys. And that includes the Wasatch Front and Salt Lake City. There's little doubt that if these places were generating significant amounts of dust, which would be likely, that dust would be windborne to this part of Utah. So it directly affects or could affect public health and also visual aesthetics here, as well as in the western side of the state and of course, Nevada. Now, in addition to those environmental impacts, there are dramatic human impacts to the local economies. Essentially, agriculture and outdoor recreational tourism, which are significant components. Recreational tourism has grown recently. Agriculture is the long-standing one. These would essentially be eliminated, and the communities that have grown up and that survive on the basis of them would also be wiped out. and Native American communities, including a number of tribes and bands within the Western Shoshone Nation, and also the Goshute tribe, would be directly impacted in very problematic ways. The Goshute Reservation itself could very well have its groundwater supply drawn down and impacted by this pumping. For the broader array of Western Shoshone tribes, it's more a matter of the fact that the area targeted by this project lies in the heart of the Aboriginal homelands of both the Goshute tribes and the Shoshone tribes and bands. And there are many historically and culturally or spiritually significant, if not sacred sites, that are centered on water resources and the water supply, and those would all be imperiled. Now, I didn't realize how quickly the time would go by, so I'll try to be very quick about how we responded. But I think I want you to know that as a lawyer, in doing this kind of work I've learned over the years, and in this particular campaign, it was sort of reached to a level above any previous one, where as much of my time was probably spent doing outreach to the grassroots and organizing and a sort of non-lawyerly counseling and communication about what are the issues and values that are of greatest importance to the people affected, how can they best articulate that, and also trying to encourage and motivate them to some degree to actually get involved in the process, and when they are shut out of the process, to make a big issue about it, to try and clamor for more attention and create a need to have a discussion with the local communities and their allies in the environmental and social justice community more broadly, that talks about values of rural communities, cultural and historical legacy, economic diversity, localized food production, and having viable or sustainable, diverse bases of local food production, and also having a more diverse economy for the state of Nevada in particular. So that is a good part of the work in this campaign, and I think, quite frankly, for a lawyer or a professional who seriously wants to be involved in counteracting pressures for interbasin transfers, it requires that, because you cannot approach it as a narrow legal technician and hope to be more than a very small piece in a strategy. I know my time is probably about over, but I'm just going to say that legally, I do want to mention this. Legally, I think, in my experience, the most effective, perhaps the only genuinely effective way to counteract this, given the amount of money and the amount of political power on the part of those advancing these big interbasin transfers, legally you have to be attacking it at every level of government. The federal level is, when it's applicable, and it almost always is in the West because there are public lands involved, involves challenges under the environmental laws and the public land management law, and where possible also using federal Indian law. And there's the Endangered Species Act, there's the National Environmental Policy Act, there are other laws that in an individual case may be applicable. Many of these will allow you to at least create potential constraints and delays for a project. Some of them, the ESA may allow you to halt it completely, but there are usually procedural devices or choices for the government agencies or the private sector players with government backing to respond to those. The other level that's most common is state law, and there the water law of the states is actually sometimes an important and valuable tool. Environmental lawyers typically don't think of water law as necessarily very beneficial in the West, but it can be used very effectively to protect both existing rights, and this goes back again to the concept of private individuals having some kind of right to water, at least under certain circumstances, that is legally cognizable and legally defensible in court or in administrative settings. So the state water law actually can frequently be used to try and protect local economic interests or values and local environmental conditions. The public trust doctrine is also a state law issue that may or may not be applicable, and with some constituencies it's unacceptable. So even if some of us like the idea of applying the public trust more broadly, if we're going to be true to the local folks who are most in danger, we have to be flexible about pursuing those particular types of devices. And finally, the local government level is one that I think is very frequently neglected and is actually potentially a very powerful and useful arena in which to do this work. And I say that because I think that planning, land use planning, water planning, and economic development planning at a local level in not only the big urban centers but also in rural communities is a way of encouraging a discourse and then enshrining certain types of policy preferences and goals in a way that then can influence and constrain decision makers in both the state law and federal law arena. And I would say the same is true of ordinances. Now, in this particular campaign, none of the rural counties involved have adopted ordinances that would articulate a goal of or a means of protecting water locally or a policy of discouraging certain types of damaging exports of water. But that has been done in California and New Mexico, and it does represent, I think, an effective bottom-up way of trying to influence policy and influence decision makers. I guess since I'm out of time, I won't be able to talk about the media strategy. And all I will say, though, very briefly before you send me away, is that 5.5 years ago when I started working on this campaign, everyone assumed that this project was unstoppable. It had been fast-tracked. There was no serious opposition that was organized. And many, many people who were concerned and opposed were being effectively shut out of the process. Now we have an entirely different position. Water rights that were previously granted to the Southern Nevada Water Authority have been rescinded or nullified by a Nevada Supreme Court decision we won. The procedure has been set back to the beginning. We have not defeated the project, but we've set it back to the beginning. The process has now been reopened. It is currently being noticed, and the general public and organizations and individuals who are opposed to this and could not participate before now will be able to participate and be involved. The Indian tribes who have been most affected and are most threatened by the project were ill-served, to put it mildly, by the BIA during the first sort of cycle of decision-making. Because that's now been undone, the tribes are actively involving themselves with their own legal counsel and have also used the National Historic Preservation Act and certain other legal claims or theories to pressure the BIA into taking a much more proactive and cooperative approach to the evaluation and the protest of this. So the project has been set back, the process has been opened up, and we still have many challenges, including the challenge of building a better case for plausible alternatives, including conservation, more flexible management practices on the Colorado River, and where it's appropriate, desalination, if that can also play a part without too many negative unintended consequences. In addition, I think an essential element of trying to deal with this type of threat, interbasin transfers, is the economic one. And I mean that in a very limited conventional sense. In my experience, there are legal devices based on the environment, based on water rights, perhaps other ones grounded in other areas of the law that you can use. But it's very important if you wish to change the minds of the people backing or agreeing with these proposals to make some sort of a cogent economic case against the project. There tend to be uncritical assumptions that the projects will be cost effective or that the growth that they're intended to fuel or feed is somehow, on balance, a positive economic thing for the communities that are concerned. And I'll just wrap up by saying that I think a full cost analysis and accounting of these projects tends to disprove that every time. Now, that may not be true in every instance, but the true costs of this kind of water provision and the true, an honest accounting of the potential harms and the unsustainability of the water source usually has a profound effect on the thinking of people who are more business-minded, who are concerned with the economic bottom line. And if they can be shown that this is more costly than alternatives, including the ones I mentioned, particularly conservation, then that frequently peels away some of the business and political support that these projects typically enjoy. So I'll wrap up. Sorry for running over.
Thank you. All right, our last speaker today, LaDawn.
I think you have to talk in there for
LaDawn Haglund is from Arizona State University. She's assistant professor of justice and social inquiry and director of the undergraduate certificate in human rights. She's also a faculty fellow at the Center for Law and Global Affairs, the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, and senior sustainability scholar at the Global Institute of Sustainability. She will be talking today on constructing the public of public goods, the role of organizing principles.
Good afternoon. Okay, so poor Simeon is sandwiched in between two Latin American scholars trying to get his Utah, Nevada case in there. I'm going to move us back to the global context, and I'm going to also move us a little bit away from the empirical, even though what I'm lecturing on today, or giving my talk on today, hopefully I'm not lecturing. What's the matter?
You've lost your screen here.
Oh, here we go. Ta-da. Let me grab my... I'm actually going to give a talk that's based on a book that I just wrote that came out in August of last year. I believe I have it here. Called Limiting Resources, Market-Led Reform and the Transformation of Public Goods. And my talk is on is basically on the theoretical construction of the idea of public goods. Even though my book is based on empirical research, most of what I want to talk about today are the values that are embodied in different kinds of institutional arrangements. And the focus of analysis for the book was marketization or privatization of public goods, specifically water and electricity. And I look at both the principles underlying the different policy changes as well as the institutional ramifications. And my conclusions, to spoil it for you, are that market-friendly policies, sometimes privatization, sometimes simply commodification or marketization, created rather than alleviated barriers to reaching development goals. And the kinds of barriers that were created were fiscal, institutional, and legal. And I want to explain in this text how this happened. So the first thing I want to say is that the right to adequate housing has often been seen as a place where you derive other kinds of rights, like the right to water, electricity, and sanitation. And the right to housing is pretty well established in international conventions and treaties. I won't go through those because we kind of touched on that earlier. Within that context of establishing the right is also the obligations that are established for states and international institutions to respond to the needs of citizens for basic public services. And also included in a lot of the language are accountability mechanisms to which citizens can turn when the need for basic services goes unmet. Now, despite very real and important disparities between this language and the actual realization of these rights, the principles are accepted, at least on an ideational level, in many, many places of the world. And this can be seen in the reiteration of these principles in constitutions in many countries in the developing world. Some of the countries that I'm studying now, for example, India, Brazil, South Africa, have different iterations of embodying these kinds of human rights to public goods within their constitutions. What do I have on the screen? Okay. So in Latin America, public ownership, central planning, and protective measures for workers and citizens were often part of what's called a developmental state. So I want to give a little bit of history of where we got to the point where public goods were privatized. In the post-war period, in what's called import substitution industrialization, produced coalitions of industrialists and urban working classes who were demanding access to services. Citizens began to make claims for things like health, education, water, and public housing, while emerging business interests demanded better electricity, communication, and transportation. States who had countries where a lot of these services were initially private suddenly found these nationalization processes happening where states began to take over services because of their inadequacy for some of these larger societal goals. So even under authoritarian governments, infrastructure in electricity, health, and water services grew in this period. Meanwhile, the Cuban Revolution and its promise of social justice for all gave new urgency to development policy, inspiring the foundation of U.S. President Kennedy's Alliance for Progress and the Inter-American Development Bank, which was created as a source of funding for Latin American countries seeking to build roads and telephone networks, etc. In a large number of countries, and with sometimes success, not always, the state took a proactive role in the provision of essential goods. Now, starting in the 80s, there was a huge paradigm shift in economic thinking. And the kinds of economic rationality that we sort of drink as mother's milk in this country began to be introduced as a way of managing public goods in Latin America. The story is pretty well known for development scholars, but I'll briefly outline it here. State-led development, which was once central to the expansion of basic infrastructure, gave way to greater market-led development. And this was spurred on by debt crisis. States that had borrowed petrodollars, for those of you who don't know what it is, you can ask me in the Q&A, borrowed a bunch of petrodollars to finance economic development. After the global oil crisis and the interest rate hikes of the late 1970s, suddenly found themselves with crippling debt. At the same time, the IMF and the World Bank and other international financial institutions started to lend in order to alleviate some of these problems, but they were de-emphasizing in their structural adjustment programs state-led development and began to favor private initiatives, and Susan already touched on this a little bit. And this left state-led projects in utility sectors without funding. One of the electricity executives from a state-owned firm in Costa Rica that I interviewed explained it this way, quote, "We've historically had a partner in the Inter-American Development Bank, but they changed course in terms of the conception of economic models. They said, we're not going to continue supporting the electricity sector and even less telecommunications if investment is public," end quote. And this is not unusual. You can find this happening in countries all over the world. Now, what were the consequences of this transformation from state-led to market-led development? My book explores the contours of this in quite a bit of detail, outlining some of the potential contradictions between different state goals, shifts in institutional structures, and some of the political struggles that came about because of these shifts towards privatization, marketization of public goods. I'm not going to spend too much time on the empirical puzzles. I'll just say that there were two puzzles in particular that drove the study, both of them involving deeper issues of political economy and the sociology of knowledge. One was, why was the effort to promote privatization so widespread throughout Latin America, regardless of institutional and political context, and regardless of emerging evidence of its shortcomings? Was it because, as Margaret Thatcher argued, there is no alternative, or was there something else happening here? And the second question that I wanted to address was, if privatization and marketization provide better solutions than the state, and in this case, by the state, I don't mean just a national centralized state, I also mean more localized community solutions, why was there so much resistance? Was it because the people just couldn't get it together and didn't know what was good for them? Or are there other alternatives? So I deal with these at great length in the book. I have some deeper theoretical concerns. And I'm using Carl Polanyi, politically historian, who described an earlier period of liberalization, economic liberalization, which is, we know it as neoliberalism in this era. He described moves towards self-regulating markets in the 19th century as what he calls, quote, a stark utopia that caused great social disruption. The late 20th century saw a reemergence of many of these market principles as the primary reference around which to organize activities, economic activities. And in order to grasp the ramifications of this, I tried to outline what exactly happens in my countries of interest. I'll tell you about those in just a second. Today I'm going to discuss why the traditional economic approaches to public goods fail to take into account the wider context within which economic activity is embedded and why this creates problems. Okay, let me just... So Polanyi, maybe I can skip over part of this. The important point, I'm using these different ideas in the book, but an important part of public policy, I argue, is resolving disjunctures among organizing principles. And the argument is that economic organizing principles are only one set of principles that are used to create public goods. There are a lot of others. And when economic principles are put forward as the primary way to organize public goods, you get a lot of resistance, you get conflicts, you get undesirable alternatives to public goods. All right. So here are my cases. Because of my interest in human rights, I chose water and electricity sectors because they're related, very much related to the realization of human rights. They're central to both economic and human development. And it's widely agreed that even if states aren't the providers, they have to still ensure that these rights are available to citizens. And the privatization of public utilities directly affects the capacity of people to make claims for public goods such as these. I chose El Salvador and Costa Rica for reasons that I won't go into, except to say that in both countries, privatization of essential goods followed an economic logic that oftentimes did not, especially in Costa Rica, did not fit with the prevailing logics around which public goods were organized. And this has eluded democratic debate almost entirely in both cases, which, as you can probably guess, caused quite a bit of social upheaval. And you can see these are different pictures of public forums where citizens are trying to take back that space and protests that have come about as a result. This is another one. I like this. This is in Costa Rica. This is the attempt to privatize ICE, which is the large electricity firm that I mentioned earlier. So the sign says it's got the government functionary saying to the transnational corporation, "You rope it. I'll rope it and you buy it." So it's tying the hands of the company so that it's weakened in order for it to be more easily privatized. Let's see. So my methodology, comparative historical and key informant interviews. And I won't spend any more time on that, but you can ask me about how I did this if you'd like to later. So today I'm going to talk about constructing the public. Now here is a classic typology of public goods. The field of economics frames public goods provision primarily in reference to markets rather than the public or the state. Markets are seen to be the most efficient allocation mechanisms so that nobody can be made better off without someone else being made worse off. That's the underlying idea of allocative efficiency. Public goods are those that markets are unable to provide efficiently due to characteristics of the goods themselves. In these cases, state intervention is justified to remedy or prevent what's called market failure. Two criteria are used to distinguish public goods, rivalry and excludability. So rivalrous goods, I'm sorry for you econ majors, you're probably very bored with this. Rivalrous goods are those that once taken or consumed by one person cannot be used by another. So goods sold in supermarkets or fish in common waters, for example. Non-rivalrous goods are those that are available regardless of how many people use them, like policing or lighthouses. Excludable goods are those that can be denied to people without a great deal of difficulty. And so goods bought and sold for a market price, for example. And non-excludable goods are those for which it would be costly or impossible to exclude users, like in the case of common land or military protection. So while many of the goods that we consume are private in the upper left corner, our most essential goods are often either pure public goods or semi-public or mixed goods. Now, this analysis is the foundation for a neoclassical definition of public goods. And states are supposed to intervene only when markets fail to do their job properly. Now, I don't want to go into all the detail, but states are central to this, this alleviating of market failure. So, though this rivalry excludability paradigm helps us to understand how and why markets fail, it doesn't offer us very much guidance regarding what are the legitimate spheres of public intervention. And it also doesn't explain real-world instances of public goods. So empirically, public goods may fit a certain category, but not because of the goods. It's because of decisions that in some participatory way, a society decides those public goods are going to be. So there's nothing necessarily inherent to the goods themselves as the model implies. So take forests as an example. That might be a club good. It could be national parks with fees. It could be public good, a protected area with fees, with no fees but public access. It could be private property, or it could be non-protected common access goods. So this is one thing, a forest, that doesn't necessarily fit into any category that we as a public or our representatives decide is a public good or not. Now, the assumption behind the framing of classical economics is that markets should be the allocation mechanism, and governments should only intervene when absolutely necessary. And that's one of the key points here, because they're thought to be the promoters of both efficiency and justice. And I won't go into all of that, but this is my argument about how the imposition of more and more market-oriented principles as organizing principles suppressed other alternatives, saying that efficiency and justice, as we've defined it in this model, is really the best way to move forward. And I document how this has happened in the public goods sectors in both of my countries. Okay, some of these market-based principles include pricing, supply and demand, efficiency, as I mentioned, incentives, profit maximization, individualistic pursuit of self-interest, property rights, and capital accumulation. So these are some organizing principles that could be used to construct public goods. Now, what I do after this is I try to expand this conception of public goods to try to take into some of the things that actually we do really care about in society. In this room, we have a lot of people that care about sustainability. We have a lot of people that care about social justice. And it's very difficult to include those kinds of concerns when your organizing principles are mainly economic principles. So I'm basically expanding the conceptual pool of organizing principles beyond those of economics. So in public goods sectors, especially, this sort of broad theoretical framing is really important for understanding how development and implementation of policy are going to really address human needs in ways that are holistic and respond to human reproductive needs and ecological reproductive needs. So I won't have time to go over every one of these, but here are some examples of the different principles besides market principles, which are in the bottom right. There are ecological principles, protection of the land, long-term sustainability, unperturbed nature. These are all values that we might hold and we might choose as principles to organize our policy. There are political principles that Susan did a great job of talking about, the participatory importance of participation, power, making explicit what it means to include principles of political inclusion. Social principles have to do with citizenship, equity, social reproduction, etc. Now, a range of policy options exist to address shortcomings in the market mechanism as an allocator of goods. So states intervene by usage regulations, incentives for conservation, information dissemination, and all of these have been applied to common pool resources. Universal provision is another example. And governments and communities have employed techniques including subsidies and transfers to address inequality and meet basic needs for excluded populations. And this, again, underscores the centrality of the state in the provision of public goods. And as I show in the rest of the book, the degree and type of state intervention considered permissible, this is key, has to do with the philosophical or value orientation of the participants in the process of making these decisions. So in the subsequent chapters, I talk about what happens when more neoliberal policies or market-oriented policies are implemented in electricity and water sectors. I just want to quickly talk about some of the sectoral effects that I did find in the empirical research. So I had three basic areas where I looked. So the utilities themselves, so the water company, the electricity company in each country, the regulatory structures, and then the financing mechanisms, all very important aspects of public goods, and these are on the institutional side. So there was a shift. Let's see, this is the state one, right? Okay. During the transition, public utilities faced retrenchment, commodification, unbundling, decentralization, causing a great deal of fragmentation and disarticulation with other kinds of goals besides economic goals or principles. Meanwhile, trade instruments like CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, effectively banned governments from favoring state-led development or state providers, and the international financial institutions, as I mentioned, stopped lending to states. Efforts to ensure full cost recovery squoze the poorer consumers, while the elimination of cross-subsidies placed severe constraints on solidarity development, which is a model that Costa Rica has been famous for. They have very high coverage of water and electricity. Many companies achieved cost savings at the expense of workers, who were often downsized and flexibilized. The regulatory strategy shifted from coordination among state agencies, the kind of coordination that's necessary to protect, for example, water basins, and went instead towards protecting competition, because the idea is with competition you get greater efficiency. And in fiscal policy, basically discretionary instruments designed for social ends were eliminated in favor of rule-based macroeconomic management, which ended up debilitating private goods sectors. So I want to say that with the neoclassical approach applied to public goods sectors in this era of neoliberalism, it effectively reduced the options available to states for solving public goods problems. And let's see, I'm going to skip some of this because I only have a minute left. Okay, so instead of strengthening the state, as we were talking about, as Susan mentioned, markets were turned to for just about everything, from environmental debt to electricity marketing, etc. Private property rights and pricing remain the preferred means for overcoming problems, and enlightened self-interest was supposed to automatically lead somehow to effective outcomes. So in other words, and inequality, this is also a key thing, where goods were once cheap or subsidized, they were moved to more expensive full cost recovery regimes, and this actually shrunk the pool of resources that were considered public and allowed for the increased inequality among sectors within society. And so inequality in access to goods, which we usually think of as a problem, was actually a solution to the issue of public goods. So back to the organizing principles, you see a shift with neoliberalism towards the bottom right quadrant and a minimizing and reducing of the other kinds of principles. And I document all of these different principles and how they were sort of reduced, but I don't have time today. So I'm going to conclude by saying that the cases of Costa Rica and El Salvador illustrate disembedding of public goods from substantive concerns in society and re-embedding in market priorities. And this re-embedding was accompanied by mechanisms that actually locked in reforms. It's like that we were talking about, can't turn off the spigot once the water's coming out of Utah. It's the same kind of locking in of policies in ways that are very hard to reverse under trade agreements, under GATS, which is a trade and services agreement, under the WTO, etc. These mechanisms lock in the policies, thereby shrinking options for states who really are trying to use all available alternatives to solve lack of access to water and electricity. And one of the other things that came out, and I really will try to, okay, how many minutes did you go over? I get to at least exceed by that much. No, I won't. So one of the other things I found is that the places most in need of outcomes that the reformers promised were the ones least equipped to be able to handle the imposition of markets because of their pre-existing weaknesses in the state and pre-existing lack of political will, etc. But then that raises the question, if the places most in need of the promise of what marketization has to offer are the ones least capable of utilizing the benefits of markets, then it calls into question the whole paradigm, and it requires scrutiny as to why we don't just strengthen state and community options. And what I'm trying to do, and this is my last comment, is present a rethinking of public goods in such a way that removes it from this sort of technocratic understanding of what efficiency is and re-embeds it in a broader set of values that are easily identifiable if we sit and think about it for half a second, because it seems insane to destroy our planet for economic efficiency reasons, yet we keep doing it because we prioritize certain kinds of principles without giving equal status to some other very important principles that we also hold. And so that's kind of the takeaway message from this book. Okay, thank you. I was going to talk about my emerging research, which is actually about translation of human rights into practice, but I'll skip that.
So we'll arrange the presenters up here and take questions. And if you're directing it to a particular presenter, please make that.
Hello. Okay. Hi, my name is Chris Jensen. I'm with a local nonprofit organization that does humanitarian work in Latin America, specifically in Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. I had a question regarding the social public model, which I thought was very important, especially in debate, especially amongst Latin Americanists or international policymakers. We talked a little bit about the policy constraints that are put on developing nations, especially within Latin America, because of neoliberalism, the whole privatization process in the 1990s. And we know that there has been kind of some political shifts in Latin America, especially in South America, that have been more favorable towards this social public model that was mentioned. But I wanted to ask a question to our presenters about what can be done on a local level, or first of all, what are some local obstacles to forming these kinds of social public or co-management, co-responsibility type models, and what can be done on a local level for nonprofits or activist groups in Latin America?
Should we take a few questions or one at a time? Yeah? Okay. So the question is about what can be done at the local level. What are the barriers to constructing these models? I would highly encourage anyone who is interested in that question to look very carefully at the case of Cochabamba, because in some ways my work is inspired by the case of Cochabamba, because this is the famous case of the water war, where in some ways you have the best of possible possibilities for a social public model to emerge, which is what happened. When they kicked out Bechtel and the private company, they remodeled the governance structure of the public water company to have elected board of governors. Now, to make a long story short, it was still underneath a neoliberal government when this happened, and so there was a number of constraints still at the international and local level policy-wise. And one of the major problems that public companies in particular still face, and this is still the case, is the trend towards what we call corporatization, or forcing public companies to act more like private companies. Meaning that even when you kick out the private profit-seeking provider, a public company is forced to do things like ring fencing, meaning organizing the finances of the company to act like you end up charging the person in the next department for services to make sure that everything is accounted for well. So barriers at the local level include those international constraints which still exist, especially if you're talking about examples where there is international funding. But I think we also need to talk very seriously about the entrenched elites in Latin America. And I think one of the really important points that LaDawn makes in her book over and over again is the importance of tax reform. When you're talking about publicly provided services, you need to have progressive taxation systems. And one of the Pandora's box, which apparently in Utah is about population, well, in Latin America, it's about getting the rich to pay taxes. If you want to have public services, you have to pay taxes. And there hasn't been enough discussion or enough emphasis on that. So in terms of what NGOs can do, I mean, I teach international development. For the most part, when we're talking about most examples in Latin America, Venezuela, Bolivia, maybe Ecuador, I tell my students hands off. They don't need your help. Don't go there. Peru, Colombia, I think are very different cases where activists are still seeking international solidarity as a way to pressure their own neoliberal governments to make policy changes. So that's sort of a short answer to a very complicated question, which is an excellent one and perhaps will provoke other reactions. But
I'll go first just to stay on the Latin America theme, and then you can get more practical. Sound good? So I would say, from my perspective, something that people, are you talking about doing something here in order to help alleviate the situation elsewhere? Is that the kind of the question? Or if, okay. Well, I think solidarity is very important, not just plopping yourself down on the ground. I agree with Susan, like plopping yourself down on the ground somewhere where they already sort of have it together doesn't make a lot of sense. What is very useful is to have a population here that pays attention to things like trade agreements. Especially, well, I mean, we've already passed NAFTA and CAFTA. We have, I think Maud Barlow yesterday mentioned something like 2,600 bilateral agreements exist in the world. These are the Trojan horses for public goods. This is where investor rights begin to be protected over and above the rights of citizens to have a say in how their public goods are protected. And this is something that if our government is partly responsible for continuing to push things like the General Agreement on Trade and Services, or otherwise known as GATS, which forces public entities in other countries to compete with transnational corporations, then we're implicated. We're implicated in our government's support for international coercion, is how I look at it. So that's one thing. Pay attention to global policy, and not that we have a lot of power to do anything as individuals, but as coordinated citizens, we do have power. Yeah, I'll just leave it there and let you offer some more practical suggestions.
Well, I don't know if I do have practical suggestions, because the work I do is mostly in the context of already existing conflicts over the allocation of water resources. But I would say just working locally, working within the American West, virtually every community that I've ever worked with has a public water system. There are what you could call private, or perhaps I wouldn't call them public-private, but they're a less formalized public water system in community wells or mutual domestic water users associations in small rural communities. That's not uncommon. In this country, people talk about, but on a very localized level in terms of water systems for the provision of basic, drinking water and water for sanitation, it's not very common in my experience that there's a problematic implementation or influence of the foreign trade agreements. I think on an overarching level, they have the potential to strip local governments and state or provincial governments of the ability to institute greater protections for local access or rights to water and its use if it gets treated as a commodity in international trade. But in practice, that isn't the main barrier or obstacle. It relates more to the integrity of what is supposed to be established practices of governance. And so where decision-making is not transparent or where public participation is meant to occur and doesn't or is not permitted, those are the most significant obstacles that I've encountered. And typically it's met, and if it's overcome, it's done by local organizing at a grassroots level, and usually it's local political pressure. I'm a lawyer, so when I'm in the picture, there's usually a legal threat as well, and that can be very useful. It's not necessarily always a solution to threaten or bring a lawsuit, but one of the activists who first got me involved in these issues has a saying, which is that, like politics, all water is local. And then he also says, and it always seems to come down to a vote. And I think that I don't know much about contexts in other countries, but if you can marshal and organize a referendum or a vote of some sort, even if a decision appears to have been made or a system appears to have been subjected to some kind of privatized or marketized structure, that can be undone with public action that needs to be organized politically. And I don't think it makes sense to go into particular legal actions that might be taken in one state or another.
Other questions?
Simeon, are you familiar with the Million Pipeline project? And if so, what are your thoughts on the chances of success for that?
Is this the pipeline that's been proposed to take water from Flaming Gorge to the Front Range? I'm not terribly informed. I do know about the basic proposal. Without knowing the details, I had a certain level of skepticism about its viability on a sort of political level as well as other levels, maybe economically or legally. I think that there are problems within Colorado, and I don't know to what extent the same is true in Utah, where I think there would be a great deal of public opposition, particularly people on this side of the Sierra Nevada. There was, a large proposed groundwater transfer from an area in southern Colorado about a decade ago, and it was defeated through a number of different actions, but it essentially amounted to an upswell of opposition and the just basic hurdles that would be faced in transporting the water over the Rockies. Did I refer to them as the Sierra Nevada a moment ago?
Mm-hmm. Wrong direction.
Okay. I meant the Rockies. So on that level, I would expect that it might not have legs to begin with, but I think I heard other people who are more informed or knowledgeable than me, and that might have included Professor Adler, saying that there were questions of relative priority, and the water was so low down in priority in an area of water shortage already that it wouldn't be very practical to be trying to purchase and pay the money to transfer that water. So on a purely sort of economic level, it might not be water worth purchasing at the, I imagine, very substantial cost that it would take to transport it. And I guess last, legally, there's this question of priority. I don't know enough about it to know other details. Certainly from activists, I think I've heard about environmental concerns as well as potential impacts to senior water rights holders on this side of the Rockies.
This question's for Simeon. I had to step out for a minute, so maybe you already asked this, but would you be willing to speculate on what you think the outcome of the Southern Nevada Water Authority pipeline thing will be?
Yes, I'd be willing, but I have to be honest. It's hard for me to speculate in a disinterested way because I'm so personally invested in fighting it. So I have thoughts about what I think is possible and I would like to see. Those are maybe a little bit different than what a disinterested observer would predict. I think there is a good probability that the project will never be built because I think that once the truth emerges about the full cost of building that infrastructure and then providing water to Southern Nevada through it on an ongoing basis, it's not going to appear to be a wise decision or a cost-effective alternative. Sometimes a project can develop so much inertia behind it that it's hard to get people to stop pushing it forward, particularly, I think, within an administrative agency or something like the Southern Nevada Water Authority. The sense of commitment and investment in the project may be difficult to pull people away from. But I think that economically it's very problematic. I think environmentally and on a sort of socioeconomic level in terms of the impacts to rural Nevada and western rural Utah, it would be devastating. Politically, that's been an effective message within the state of Nevada at the state level. I don't know that that alone would be enough to stop a project like this. But I do know that there's very determined opposition on a number of different levels. Economic, people who would take primarily an economic angle of attack, people who would attack it primarily on legal bases. I think it faces a lot of legal challenges under federal environmental laws, and I think the road to hoe under state water law is going to be a tough one. The Water Authority has billions of dollars at its disposal. It has a great deal of other types of resources that I think it can implement to try and push the project forward. But I would hope that over time, alternatives that are more cost-effective will emerge or be recognized and accepted, and that there'll be a pulling away from the project. I think there will be pipelines built. There are so many of them that certainly I and the people I work with are not able to fight them all. I think they will build some smaller local ones that they already have permits for in the lower part of that basin. Well, I shouldn't call it a basin. There are many basins, but the flow systems that go into the Colorado River, which may be very problematic. I also think it's possible, although I hope it's not the case, that a smaller version of the pipeline will ultimately be able to be built. And I think that particularly Snake Valley is one where the pipeline may be pushed out of it because of Utah's interests, because of the Great Basin National Park, and so therefore the greater level of federal agency opposition. And I think that's sort of the epicenter of organized rural resistance. But I think it would be tragic if the pipeline were built through those other valleys, particularly Spring Valley. Now, it's conceivable that, well, actually, I think if Spring Valley as well as Snake Valley were taken out of the equation, then the pipeline becomes even more obviously not rational or not cost-effective to build. That's sort of my take on it.
Can you hear me? My name is Terry Marasco, and I have a resort out in Nevada and got to know Simeon because my resort is threatened. And I've been at this since November of '04 when I bought it. And the feeling I have, and I've been close to this for 6 years, is that it will never happen because of the immense resistance that we have put up against this legally and through PR. As a matter of fact, about 4 years ago, Pat Mulroy said in a public meeting, desal is 40 years away. About a year ago, in front of Harry Reid in another meeting, she said, we're negotiating with someone, I think it was the San Diego desal plant. All of a sudden, she's come around. At that same meeting, this is not a joke, by the way, she said, well, we're thinking seriously about a pipeline to the Mississippi Delta to catch the water before it goes into the ocean. So help me God, Harry Reid is my witness.
Is this working? Oh, yes, it's working. Okay. So I have a question to shift focus for a minute back to Latin America. As I was listening to LaDawn talk, saying came to my mind, which is there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. And I think that what LaDawn was describing, and also Susan to a certain extent, was much deeper than that in terms of talking about how the provision of public goods has changed over time. The institutional implications of that are really quite deep, and some would think irreversible. So I was wondering if both of you could talk a bit more about what you think are the best examples of maybe overturning privatization and marketization in the area of water rights or other areas, and particularly keeping in mind what some term as the pink tide that has overtaken Latin America, now that we have some very progressive executive leaders in various countries throughout Latin America. I'm wondering if you see real hope with that. So it's a kind of open-ended question, maybe to inspire us all a little bit.
Maybe since I'm more pessimistic than you, I'll go first.
Sure.
That's exactly my point with talking about this as a transformation of public goods. I don't think it's something that just comes and goes with the winds of the ideological winds of the age. It seems pretty clear that once you begin to institute market principles as priority, and by institute I mean passing laws that protect investor rights specifically, but also that limit what states can do. It's very hard to change. It's a slow as molasses process to try to change those institutions in ways that allow for alternatives. And this was one of the main arguments of the book, which comes from Barrington Moore's idea of suppressing historical alternatives. That once you begin to institutionalize a certain set of ideas and make that the common practice, it not only solidifies it in law, it also in law and in practice, but it also begins to create a sense of normalcy around these new norms. And this was one thing I was sort of alluding to when I said we kind of already accept markets as a primary organizing principle in this country, although we don't really have privatized water systems in the way that they did it in Latin America. We don't just let Suez come in and take over, and when it does happen, like in Atlanta, it doesn't last very long. But the institution of these principles does have very long-lasting legacy effects. Having said that, you have, for example, in El Salvador, incoming President Mauricio Funes, who has done a lot to try to strengthen the state institutions that still exist. And this is what I propose as one of the alternatives that Costa Rica actually is a good model of, strengthening state institutions in key ways so that they become capable of providing public goods. And when you do that, you begin to pry back some of that policy space. You begin to pry it open, allow for alternatives, but it becomes a difficult process. Social movements are absolutely essential to this prying open process or taking back process. And in some cases, it's gone all the way like Cochabamba, where they just like threw the darn company out. In other cases, it hasn't gone that far. There are problems with that. I mean, people died in Bolivia when this happened. So I think it reduces policy space, but not irrevocably, and that there are promising Costa Rica remains a promising alternative, I would say. Very state-centric, but there are more grassroots alternatives as well.
If I'm going to point to alternatives in Latin America, the two examples which I think are most advanced are number one, Venezuela, and number two, Bolivia. But we can't forget that this is a region as well that has an outlier in the international system, being Cuba, which we can also debate. Cuba is one of the countries of the world that you can drink the tap water. And so in terms of providing public goods, the Castro regime has been spectacular. I actually don't agree with Dawn. When we look at South America anyway, I think Central America is another kettle of fish for reasons of it's the U.S.'s backyard, and I think it's much more difficult to advance alternatives. But South America is seeing the pink tide. There are a lot of advances, and I think we are seeing advances in the provision of public goods in electricity, water, healthcare, and education, where you see major public investments increasing in countries such as Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador. It's also worth underlining the fact that under Evo Morales, Bolivia had the first surplus budget in 20 years. And so they are recuperating natural resources for funding these public goods. And that is incredibly important. And one of the demonize or love Chavez, he is taking oil money and investing that into public goods as well. University education, we can have debates about its quality, has quadrupled in Venezuela in the last 10 years. Venezuela is one of the few countries that had, well, actually, it met its Millennium Development Goals a couple of years ago. And so there are some enormous advances, and I think the pink tide has a lot to do with it. Left governments that are committed to some semblance of social democracy have a lot to do with it.
I think we have time for one more question.
Actually, my question is fairly narrow. And again, about the Las Vegas water project, where you're talking about Snake Valley or the Mississippi. I start from recalling what Las Vegas means. It means the meadows. And what was distinctive about Las Vegas before the modern city got built is the groundwater table is high enough to support grass. There's not much natural growth of grass left around Las Vegas. They pumped down the water table. But Las Vegas has been hit, as I understand it, maybe it's changed in the last few months, very hard by the economic crisis. Do they still need that water? And if so, where are they going to get the money to pay for it with the tax base eroding and so on? I mean, I don't know if you can take that on or not. But
I'm happy to. I think, Professor De La Pena, you've asked the $64 question, as they used to say. That I will talk about one practical legal result of those changed economic circumstances. The position being taken by both the private development community in Las Vegas and the Water Authority, and I suppose probably the county commissioners, is that growth is on its way back. It's just a matter of another turn of season in the economic picture, and Las Vegas will begin to explosively increase in size and activity again. Certainly some people are skeptical that it will go back to the kind of unregulated, well, maybe the regulation will remain absent, but it'll go back to the same sort of unrestrained and explosive growth that it was experiencing in the 90s and the first part of this past decade that just ended. The practical ramification of that is that the state engineer, who had gone through a series of hearings and had treated the issues as closed, whether one, there was a need for water, two, the applicant, which is the Southern Nevada Water Authority, had demonstrated the financial or fiscal ability to actually build the project and put the water to the intended use. And three, whether there was a need for and an adequate implementation of water conservation in the service area of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. All three of those issues were decided against us in early proceedings, and they were treated as closed for future proceedings because there's a continuity among the various applications. They're all for one project, for one destination and applicant. That has now been reopened. We were able to persuade the state engineer that the change in circumstances was such that it now was an open question whether growth currently was going on in the Clark County area or was reasonably foreseeable such that the water was truly needed. And then, of course, the question of whether or not Las Vegas can get the financing to build the project. For us, this also opens an opportunity to present what I would call more of a full cost accounting of the project, to try and make the argument that it's a lot more than just a few $1 billion. It's probably a few tens of billions of dollars to actually build and implement the project. And that's something that I'm not sure Sunwha will be able to actually demonstrate the means or the ability to meet at this time. And then, of course, water conservation is an open question. The Pacific Institute and the Western Resource Advocates put together a very helpful study of water use in Las Vegas or in Southern Nevada as compared to other regions in the West or Southwest, and easily implementable, very, very practical and cost-effective conservation measures that were not being used in the Sunwha service area and that could be at much lower cost than building this pipeline project, even using a low estimate, and with greater reliability as a means of stretching the water supply to at least cover a good portion of the anticipated need. Whereas this groundwater development project is premised on pumping in a very aggressive fashion for as long as possible, but ultimately somewhere down the road, the water is going to run out or begin to generate so many problems and conflicts that there may be some, again, the administrative or political will to shut the spigot off may not be there, but there may be so many problems generated by it that it becomes a non-sustainable source of water for Las Vegas in the long run.
Okay, I think we'll cut off question. I have one announcement before. I want to thank our presenters and Sam, you have an announcement?
I guess I just wanted to sort of draw the day to a formal close and to thank all of our panelists and keynoters for their contributions and the audience for great questions. I think we've sort of gotten a sort of beginning picture of the complexity of these issues, and I think we've heard repeatedly that we can't be too narrow and we have to think about values and what we mean by rights, my rights, our rights, human rights, and I think that's all been sort of tossed around, and there's been some good dialogue started on that. And that will be, I hope, continued tomorrow. I hope many of you can make it. Tell your friends. We'll be starting also with panel 3 tomorrow at 9 a.m. here, and that panel is on water quality, ecosystems, and the restoration, community well-being, and public health, followed by a consecutive panel on water conflict case studies. So thank you, and welcome back tomorrow. Thanks.